Hello, welcome to this edition of Beyond the Politics, a regular examination of the events happening right here in the Quinte region and the people who work so hard behind the scenes to make it all happen. I'm your host, Paul Martin. Joining me, Belleville Mayor Neil Ellis.
Good morning, Paul. Thanks for having me on today. And how are things with you?
Things are great, and so many things are happening, and we have had actually people from the city of Belleville in for the past two shows while things have sort of progressed through. But I thought it was time, now that we've had sort of a chance to see the initial events and then some of the aftermath and the follow-up and the development, for you to give us some context on what happened 2 months ago now in February. Of course, I'm talking about Belleville's overdose emergency. In the early days of February, there was an incident which was not unique, but which peaked near a new high level, where 13 people were taken in for medical care after experiencing a form of drug overdose or drug poisoning, is perhaps even more accurate. 14, including one the next hour, and well over 20 in a 24-hour period. This stretched Belleville and, in fact, the area through Hastings-Quinte paramedics' resources to the breaking point, to the point where which there was concern over what should happen if something happened outside of that area. For a small period of time, there was restricted access or a recommendation to avoid a particular area near downtown Belleville. And as a result, we have since, for the past 2 months, had extra national media coverage, discussions about the Bridge Homelessness Hub and a detox center, visits from provincial ministers, and so much more. So,
you wrapped it up pretty good there, Paul.
With it was a lot. There was a lot that was going on for a long period of time. And of course, and before we even get into it, one of the things I want to talk about is, some people this took off guard, but for anyone who really knows what's been going on, and that's why I wanted to stress that, there have been 2 other days which peaked at 10 overdoses. So this was the highest they had, the most. It was more extreme, but it was not a unique situation, and it's something that's been building for some time, and it is something that is still ongoing. We still see overdoses, multiple overdoses, virtually every day in the city.
Yes, and it's very unfortunate for everybody involved in that, and we were lucky on that day that the emergency services were able to deliver and save everybody. It started basically back in November. If you remember, we had 90 overdoses the first week in November, which opened everybody's eyes to have that many, whereas we're usually, maybe 5 to 10 a week type thing. At that time, council endorsed a motion to send to the province, to say to the province that we need help. There doesn't seem to be a solution. Most municipalities in Ontario, across Canada, have the same issues with drugs in their community, and it's not just a Belleville issue. And when you look as near as Quinte West or Deserano or Bancroft, even Cobourg and Oshawa, they were all faced with the same overdoses. That motion went unanswered, so we swing into February, basically 3 months, 90 days or after. And we have the situation at Bridge Street when we had, I believe, 13 overdoses, you said in that number. It was an hour, and when it happened in an hour, that basically taxed our services. All ambulances from all other communities were here. Emergency in Belleville was full, and it was basically a code to move forward. Having sat down with the fire chief at the time in emergency services, we didn't know what was ahead of us. We thought, okay, if we had that many in one day, there was a bad batch of drugs that were in town, and we later found out that was the new drug, Trank, which is a very serious drug that's come up through the States that I believe Narcan and that don't work with. So we're faced of what's the next step. Emergency services, EMS, police, and fire that respond to all the calls were taxed. They're running to the end. So when we looked at moving forward, how do we get help from the province? And we have some tools in our toolbox, and that was to decide to call an emergency. And other cities have done it, but haven't filed. And as near as Oshawa or Ottawa, Hamilton had done the similar thing, but didn't file with the emergency services. So sitting down with the fire chief, it matched up to about 6 criteria that you have to call, and one was death, taxing the services, and a threat to your community. And when you look at that, we decided to call the state of emergency, and that got the attention. The first media attention was when you mentioned about not to go in a certain area. The press release was released, And it probably could have been written different. That was done by the police department. It probably should have said, stay away from Bridge Street, where it said stay away from downtown, and that's what national media caught. I got calls the next day, 5, 10, you've closed your downtown, what's happening? And from there, the news picked up, and I had to explain that it was a situation that we didn't want people in the core, and it should have been written better, but that basically was picked up by a few influencers on social media. And I looked through social media and went, oh my God, jumping. It's gone across Canada and the States. It was reported in major news stories. And from there, we went to the state emergency, which entitles us to basically, not entitlement, but gives us some more tools, and such as money from the province, attention from the province, and it did.
But so many other things happened. We tagged up to the budget. Now, one of the things that Belleville did was Belleville passed its operating budget not that long ago. How happy were you with this process? Challenging year for everyone in the region basically looking at around a 5% increase, a little bit more, a little bit less, and Belleville basically fell across those lines. In the more rural areas, a little under, going up to just over 5%. How challenging a budget year was it? How happy were you with the final product?
Well, it was a challenging year in any budgets. I find are challenging. Council, basically in the inflationary times that we've had, and when you look at past budgets in surrounding communities, we were looking at under 5, and we were there, and we're still there in some of the tax wards that were there. But with adding the bridge is put it over that 1%. But when you look at surrounding municipalities, whether it's Quinte West, whether it's Tweed, Sterling, a lot of them were double digits this year. And I think to come, there's going to be a lot of double digits. But we didn't cut services. A lot of municipalities had to cut services to even get 6 or 7%. We actually raised the level of services. When I became mayor in 2000, and I guess it was 21 or 22, whatever day, it's all fog now. We haven't hired any police since 2014. So when you look at an expanding community, we are one of the highest growing census. Our population expanded by, I believe, 7,000 or 8,000 people, surrounding which we are the draw. We have over 50,000 people coming in here a day from other communities to work or to shop. Policing were at the end of a cycle that they couldn't handle the increase. And when you look at calls for service, they're up about 20% each year, and we were still looking at the same complement of officers. The police board came up with a plan, and it was endorsed at the police department, or by the police board, and council so far has also endorsed it, is to get more boots on the ground. So this budget, we actually had the hiring of 8 new officers, to bring the complement up over the next 3 years. Last year we hired 4, 8, and 6 over the 3 years to get it back up to a suitable number. Well, this is the first that police have, in I believe their history, at the end of one shift, they don't make all the calls. There's 15 or 16 calls for the next shift. And when you look at the growth of even homelessness, a lot of these calls are for the unhoused. The police have became mental health workers also, and I've been out on drive-alongs, and I've seen that and witnessed that. So we raised those services. We look at fire again. Fire hasn't been a complement of any fire personnel since the 60s. That's how long it is. And when you look at, I remember in the 60s, you go over across the bridge, and I think the sign said about 39,000 people. We didn't have all the subdivisions in Thurlow. We have apartment houses now in Thurlow also. So we've had to look at expanding our emergency services. So we delivered a budget that was in around the the 5%, if not lower, and we expanded those services. And when we look at other municipalities, are they going to have to expand these services eventually? Growth is great, but growth does catch up to you when you don't put the men and women that either provide those emergency services, or even that provide services, whether it's snow plowing, whether it's parks and things like that. So our council's been hit with that. Past councils, I don't mean to criticize, but I said to the chief, you've known the fire or the police chief that we've expanded. We've known that, and even at the election, some of the people that sat on the police board said, "Well, we know more police." Well, why didn't you do anything about it your whole 4-year term? Nothing was done. So my council and the police board have moved that forward to make this city safer, to get those calls done. And it's not only the mental health of our officers, whether it's police or fire, to work under these extraordinary circumstances and not have the backup and manpower. There is some nights, and it's scary to say, that there's only 6 officers on the ground covering the whole city. And that is unacceptable. We are waiting for a disaster to happen, and by complementing the force with new officers, this should alleviate that problem, that we have a complement out at night and daytime, protecting our city and protecting not only that, but providing services that, our mental health and issues that they unfortunately have to do.
Our thanks go out, of course, to now retiring Police Chief Mike Callahan and retiring Deputy Chief Chris Berry. Callahan will be leaving at the end of the month of April. Berry announced just in the past few days that he will also be retiring by the end of the year. But Callahan brought in a lot of services, as you were saying, talking about mental health for the officers, working on this push to hire more officers to provide more complete coverage. And he was one of the people who was basically putting his reputation on the line, because he was one of the first ones to really talk openly about a detox center. And that kind of frank discussion from a top-level police official is rare. So how much are we going to miss his leadership?
Really going to miss Mike. I didn't know the chief before I became mayor, and it was one of those situations of, how are you going to mesh, or how are you going to move the city and police force forward? The first time I met Mike, it was like I've known him all my life, and I do really respect what he's done. I've talked at, every time I see him is, why don't you stick on? Why don't you stay on for another year? He did stay on for an extra 6 months, but it's time for him to, for him in his mind to retire. I don't think it's time in my mind for him to retire, but he has over 30 years of service. And when we went through everything in being on national news, it was over 4 weeks the story covered for. It was probably one of the longest news stories that I've ever seen nationally on about what happened, and that whole, going back to that, it was to say this is happening all in rural Ontario. It's a problem here that we've centered in Belleville. Mike was frank, and I told him to Mike, I said, you're retiring, you got nothing to lose. Like, speak your mind, say what you want, because there's no, the police board probably wouldn't have said anything, but obviously the police board hires and dismisses the chief. And the police board respected what he said. He called a spade, and some of the things that he said was a lot of things that other police officers or chiefs would like to say, but unfortunately they weren't in a position that the chief had at the time.
Update us on the project for the Queenie exhibition. So that's a major undertaking. Hey, I gave you 2 whole minutes. Yes. Go ahead.
Project was way out of scope. When this council come in, I believe the first tender, or the tender they had, was well north of $30 to $40 million. The project budget allotment was around $12 or $13 million. We have it back into scope. So we, with the Belleville Agricultural Society, it's been a great run with them. Over the winter, they had the fence put up. If you look at the property, they have a building put up that was financed a lot from the federal government. They've done a lot of the earth removal. Right now, it's in the process of tendering the building out. It looks like it's going to be coming right in on budget, hopefully the tenders. I'm optimistic that something would happen this year, but as you pointed out before we started, we're into the spring season, so I maybe was too optimistic that we'd have a fair this year.
At the new site.
At the new site, yeah. But fingers crossed. There has been miracles before, and if not, it's going to be the next year. Conference center is what they're looking at. A building, I believe it's around 38,000 square feet. And that is in the plans, and they're looking at some other buildings after. And the BAS is alive and strong, and looking forward to cutting the ribbon and having this project done as soon as possible.
How much are you looking? We're about 40 seconds left. The Gunpo visit.
Gunpo is going to be fun. It's, I think, the 3rd time I've been there. So this mayor was over last year, and I met him there. Met him also. So it's a relationship that's been going on probably for about 30 years, and I think these relationships are important, whether it's Laura Germany, whether it's Gunpo, that we follow through on this. So we're going to have 10 people that are invited, a lot of staff, the president of the Chamber of Commerce, a few councillors, which do pay their own way. That was the biggest thing on any of these trips. I know under the last council, it wasn't that way, and I brought it back to the program, which we have, is if you want to go, it's on your dime.
Okay. And we're also, of course, looking forward to the Queenie International Air Show coming up on June 29th and 30th. This has been a very special edition with Belleville Mayor Neil Ellis on Beyond the Politics.